So because we're not done with Passover, there's a few more days of it. I thought I would share a little bit of what's just moving through me for this specific haya for this specific holidays. Um, so the last days leading up to Passover, and of course these last couple of nights, all of us have been focusing on leaving Egypt. We have been focusing on freedom, on leaving constricted places to find expansiveness in our lives, as I mentioned it last night. We praise, really, and rightfully so, and we seek to emulate the Israelites that in the story, as we told it last night and told it Wednesday night, eventually broke free from slavery and followed Moses to the foot of Mount Sinai. There are so many situations in our life that feel just like through the story, that feel stuck. So many parts of ourselves, our creativity, our joy, our passions that have been repressed, that have been bound up by this society, a society that doesn't really celebrate these aspects of being, these aspects of what it is to be human. And even when they do, which is somewhat rare, they also rarely rewards them with the abundance that maybe other professions that are not so artistically oriented, or someone who has a passion but it doesn't feed into the economic model. And so we may be wanting to live from those passions. We may be wanting to live from that place of joy within us, but nothing in the society in which we live rewards that or welcomes that. Really, if it's not an economic driver, then those contributions are not really looked at as necessary, right? And so the society in which we live itself is a place of confinement, is a place of constriction, just because it prefers certain kind of human expressions over others. The world we live in the Western world we live in, would like us to be, more consumers than artists. You know what I mean? I mean, that's kind of the idea in this Egypt that we live in. Though we think of ourselves as real free, right? This land is the land of freedom, as we hear all the time. If we really look deeply at what does that look like here in America today, then we might start to feel a little bit differently about this idea of all of us are free. It's mostly freedom of capitalistic expression, I would say. And though, of course, we have supposedly freedom of speech and other guarantees in our constitution, the society itself doesn't foster, doesn't care very much about the multidimensionality of what it means to be a human being. Close that parenthesis, because tonight I want to also talk about something that has really been in my heart in the days leading up to our celebrations on Wednesday and Thursday. I want to talk about the Israelites that didn't follow Moses into the desert. I want to talk about the Israelites that actually stayed behind and remained in Egypt, that ultimately chose slavery, because our teachers tell us a significant percentage of us feared the unknown more than the painful known. And since, as you know, the way I read our our stories, the way I read Torah, is that all the characters in the story, that's where I always start, that all the characters in the story are parts of myself. And if I have to be honest with that intention to approach text, then I can't ignore that fearful part of self that chooses over and over again the constricting evil I know over the possibility of the expansive unknown. And I say over and over because in the unfolding of the story of the Exodus, we continue to see that happening, even with those who have at first chosen to follow Moses, right? We see them collapsing back into their fearful self with the golden calf. We see that in the cries of those desert wanderers who time and again begged to return to Egypt. We see that in the story of the spies who went to scout the land, and 10 out of the 12 turned their backs on the promised land. So it's not just one time and you're done. It continues even in your endeavor to free yourself from one thing. There's this voice within us that wants to actually go back to those places of enslavement. So my questions really were this week as I was preparing for our celebration. Like, what is it about us? Why do we stay behind? Why do we not take the leap of faith? Why are we trying to convince ourselves that the life we have, constricted as it may be, is all that we deserve? Is all that we deserve? And because of that, we must wonder what journeys we have not taken because we feared our inner Pharaoh's retaliation, or in the story of the spies, we feared the giants in the promised land. What is that part of me that doesn't believe in me? What is that part of me that doesn't believe in me? So I wish I had an answer to give you tonight. I don't have an answer besides the beginning of one, maybe, for myself that I'm working with in these days, because I think each of us must look within and uncover for ourselves what that is, or where that comes from in our unique makeup, our unique conditioning. I suspect, nonetheless, that we all have received messages early in life from the world around us, from the people in our communities, from our teachers, our schooling, our education, from our parents, or simply from the many accidents of life that have shaped part of us. We have received messages. We have received messages that have kind of solidified that fearful Pharaoh within us, right? Now, don't get me wrong, because that voice itself also has an important part to play in our lives. And many of us would attest to the fact that that voice of hesitation, or that voice that says, you probably shouldn't do that, might have prevented many of us from making costly decisions in our life. So I'm not trying to paint a black and white picture. And though in affirming that it has its place, that voice has its place in us, I think we also need to realize that it becomes problematic when it oversteps its bounds and starts to run the show and starts to really run our lives. If that voice is really all that we hear and all that we follow, then we are not living truly the fullness of who we could become, who we are, in fact. So for me, as I am wrestling with this in my life right now, and I know I'm not the only one of the messages that I received early on in my childhood was that no matter what I did, and I'm sure many of you will relate, no matter what I did, it would never be good enough. It would never be the real deal, the real thing. It would always be just a mere substitute. And I would always be a fraud. That is the kind of messages that I received. So why then, if that's what you have received in those formative years of your life, right? Why then even venture into the wilderness? Why even venture into the wilderness if there was never going to be a Sinai? You know what I mean? Like, for me, the message was, there's never going to be a Sinai. So why even bother, right? You're never going to be good enough to reach Sinai. So why even bother? And maybe that's some of the self-talk of those in the story that did not leave Egypt, right? Maybe they had that self-sabotaging inner messages that they had never clear themselves from. Why venture into the wilderness if you were never going to reach Sinai? And I'll be honest, it took me years to disarm my Pharaoh. It took me years to see that, in fact, it really had no clothes on, but only the scary clothes that I dressed him in. I dressed him in. Someone asked me last night about the wicked child in the story of the 4 children in the Haggadah. That person came to me and was challenged by the way that that child is not only defined as the wicked one, and I have talked many times about the dangers of nicknaming children as you know, often turn to embody the nickname that was given to them as what they actually come to understand their own identity to be, through most of the time the family contexts. So that nicknaming of that child, the wicked one, right, is quite a challenge. It's quite a challenge in our Haggadah. But also another, in addition to that, to just nicknaming a child the wicked one, that child in the Haggadah is scorned for their opinion in the matter of the storytelling, the telling of the story of our leaving Egypt. I was lucky. I'll be honest with you. I was lucky that these messages I received and internalized actually turned me into the wicked child. Turned me into the rebellious child. Oh, my poor parents. But I was lucky that it turned me into the rebellious child rather than the demure child or the repressed child. So, you see, Lucy, I don't know if you're ever going to see that, but there's a great positive for that wicked child after all. Because for me, it was that rebellious child within that continued to fight with my Pharaoh. But because I continued to fight with that Pharaoh, also it meant that I couldn't leave Egypt. Right? I couldn't leave Egypt. In fact, the fighting against my Pharaoh kept me confined into Egypt. It was, to use the other metaphor of the spies and the land. It was until the giants in my inner promised land were actually seen as the gnomes that they really were, that I could finally free myself from that Egypt. I could finally walk into the next stage of my life, that next promised land. It's always a spiral, it's always a cycle. So it's not actually in fighting the Pharaoh that you free yourself from the Pharaoh. It's really to see that what you thought was a giant is really just a gnome, and that you have been dressing that giant in the clothing of your own fears all this time. So that's what has been with me, really, all the days leading up to Passover. And I was kind of wondering whether I should share that last night during our celebration, or if I should save it for this Shabbat. And obviously that's what I decided. But it's been an interesting journey to this year, to be with those who didn't leave, because we'd never talk about them. But their absence is really significant to our liberation, because they're part of us. So I want to leave you with a quote tonight. Actually, a quote that found me today. I knew that quote from long ago, and then I was listening to a podcast earlier, and that quote came around, and I was like, "Oh, this is for tonight. Thank you. I thank the universe for sending me teachings." So it's a quote, you also probably know it, and maybe you too haven't heard it for a while. It's a quote from Joseph Campbell. And to me, it speaks directly to these parts of your and myself that are afraid of leaving my Egypt, that are afraid of confronting our pharaohs. And Joseph Campbell wrote, and I leave you with that tonight. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. May you enter it now. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Amen.